Today, I do have the immense pleasure and the honor, and with the presence of Dr. Kenneth Rose. Dr. Kenneth Rose is a widely recognized scholar and a leading expert on the world religions. He holds very many academic degrees, and being also a Ph.D. in the study of religion from Harvard University. At Harvard, he was a fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Dr. Rose, is also a senior research fellow at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Dr. Rose, at the same time, is now an Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Christopher Newport University, where he was teaching during many years courses on world religions, Christian spirituality, comparative mysticism, and philosophical theology. Dr. Rose is a well expert on theologies of religions, comparative mysticism, and contemplative methods. He has published very many books, among them this highly interesting one, Yoga, Meditation, and Mysticism, that with great pleasure I have reading. A part of knowing Dr. Kenneth Rose, when I took an online course, he taught. I was impressed by his knowledge. And at the same time, Dr. Rose is very much interested and influenced by the Oriental thought, yoga, Buddhism, Hinduism, and the thought of Thomas Merton, I believe. Mm-hmm. Dr. Rose, good morning from here in Spain, where I am, in Vigo. And it's for me an immense pleasure, and I want to show you my gratitude to come to your presence in this conversation.
Well, thank you, Madonna, for inviting me to speak to you and to your friends and your community. I'm speaking from the lovely old Roman city of Trier in southwestern Germany. So, and I look forward to our conversation this morning on these themes.
So, could you tell us a tiny bit, about your personal history in this world of spirituality and how you got involved in the study of religion, and what is your, what is your practice, if you do so, about meditation or different practices like yoga and all these type of things?
Well, thanks for the question. It's since I've been practicing for over 50 years now, and in multiple traditions, it would be difficult to isolate one specific practice. So what I think would help would be to simply say a little bit about my own spiritual journey, which is a journey that many of us have followed. There's nothing new or unique about the spiritual journey. The steps on it are well marked, and whether you're reading an old Catholic mystical text or the Yoga Sutras or the Visuddhimagga, the steps of the path are clearly marked. But of course, each one of us discovers it anew. And when I discovered it as a teenager, it was I didn't know anybody else had ever walked this path. And so it was great then to discover other great teachers and great traditions in which I could learn how to follow this path. I was born in New York, in Brooklyn, in 1951. So I was a teenager during the wild hippie years, the years of the counterculture in New York. And I used to hang out on the Lower East Side in Greenwich Village and the East Village and Washington Square Park and St. Mark's Place. And it was a ferment of revolutionary ideas and cultural change and psychedelic extravagance, and Woodstock was on the horizon and the Haight-Ashbury. But what came into the middle of all of this were the Hindu teachers and the Buddhist teachers that started to come to the West, and especially in the United States and America. There was a change in the immigration laws in 1965. And suddenly within the next few years, many teachers came from India. And one of them was Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement, or ISKCON, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. And I knew nothing about this movement, except that one day I picked up a Bhagavad Gita and I began to read it. I didn't know who the Swami was. I knew nothing about the Bhagavad Gita, but I felt drawn to it. And I began to read it. And references in that book then led me to the Upanishads and other Gita translations. And this was early in 1970. And a few months later, I saw people on the street, young people my age in those days. They were dancing and singing, and they were wearing orange. I didn't even know what it was they were wearing. I had never seen a dhoti before. I hadn't been to India. And they were, the men had shaved heads and the women were wearing saris and they were playing Indian drums. And I thought, what's this? And of course, it was what everyone now knows as the Hare Krishnas, but it was new then. And I was immediately attracted to the chanting and the singing. And when I went to their temple on the Lower East Side for their feast, I was totally entranced by the encounter with the deities, Radha and Krishna. And this was perhaps my Catholic upbringing in a traditional setting predisposed me to an openness to images and such sumptuous worship ceremonies. So that was where my journey began, with the Hare Krishna movement. But that was just the first step.
And then you went to study Harvard? Or you went
Well, it's a long story, and if anybody's interested, I do tell that story in this book. Yes, The Light of the Self. It's a long story, cannot encapsulate that in a couple of minutes. So, but what happened then is that in the Krishna movement, of course, became deeply engaged in Indian culture, as Prabhupada wanted us to be, and so we were given a traditional kind of Gurukula education that initiated us deeply into the Vaishnava lifestyle. But I didn't know at the time that there were other Indian philosophies and other traditions. Of course, we were enthusiastic, we were a little bit fundamentalistic, but slowly I moved on. And what happened in my case is that my Christian background began to reassert itself. And I felt a profound need to explore the Christian tradition. And I did in various ways. That's where I encountered the writings of Thomas Merton, especially I don't know if he's as well known outside of the English-speaking world, but in the English-speaking world, in America, he was a spiritual sensation because he was a young, dissipated writer from New York who had a sudden conversion to Catholicism and then went off and became a Trappist monk from New York to a Trappist monastery in Kentucky. So of course his story became a bestseller. But that was the early Thomas Merton. The later Thomas Merton was a bold interreligious pioneer of dialogue between religions, especially Buddhism. And he's famous for having met the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in 1968. And so it was this Thomas Merton, his later writings on Buddhism and Hinduism, that alerted me to the fact that my own Catholic tradition in which I was raised had a mystical dimension to it. I didn't know that. I mean, I had a school child's knowledge of Catholicism in those days. And it was, of course, in the US, and we didn't have, like in Spain or in Italy or in France, these marvelous old monasteries, and in Italy and Spain, these churches with their deep and profound sense of silence. But I discovered all of that. I went back and discovered that we did have that in the Catholic tradition. But, there was no way that I was ever going to go back and become some kind of simple, exclusive Christian. Once I had been exposed to Hindu spirituality, there was no way that I could ever forget that. And so that began my journey of trying to bring these two streams together. And in those days, it was a conflict for me between, as I then understood it, between Jesus and Krishna. Which one? Jesus or Krishna, or both? And that's what then led me to go back to university and eventually to Harvard, where I studied this problem in a broader academic context. And from that point on, after I received my doctoral degree, then I became a professor and taught for 30 years at universities.
That sounds really highly interested, because nowadays in our secular, let's say, society,
yes,
the tendency is just to have what I call the privilege of God. In other words, there are so many religions that the believers, they become part of that creed, and in a sense you come to be like a blind faith follower, and you think that God is on your side.
yes.
When you think about these main religions in the world, 8 or 11, let's say Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and all these type of religions, what can they give us? What these religions show us? Which different paths? Because when you come to be a religious person, usually you become a believer. But I'd like to know what your opinion about the difference between theology, religion, and spirituality.
Of course, that's an excellent question, and it's a topic that that we could spend a lot of time talking about it, because for too many people, when these topics come up, if they even do in our much more secular societies today, people immediately think it's just religion, it's superstition, it's blind faith, it's fanaticism, it's wars, it's conquest of other people's. You know, I live in Germany right now, and here in Germany, this is, even though there are churches, they're not visited by many people any longer. And this is an almost completely secular society. I don't really, apart from the people I meet at Buddhist centers or at Yoga Vidya, we were just at a couple of their ashrams. There you encounter people who are deeply engaged in the spiritual life. But other than that, I don't experience really many people who are at all interested in this. And I do think that a lot of that has to do with the blending here, particularly in some parts of Europe, of the church and the state, with the result that it became a distant factor in people's lives. It was something that you paid taxes to. People pay taxes still to the churches in Germany. And the priests may or may not have been very moral, and you were raised more or less to think of life as something in which you enjoy yourself, and the church is just something on the margin of your life.
Which separation actually happened more or less in the 17th, 18th century, where these societies used to be a combination of both things, like politics, yes, and also, let's say, it's not the spiritual, but let's say religious life. Nowadays, this variety, this separation, as you are mentioning, yes, quite well. So, going back to the question, so usually, as I mentioned as well, being like a blind believers, we do not create, let's say, a degree of trying to think, deeply about what is religion itself. It just is part of our society where we grow up and we start having ideas about how to believe. So that's why I ask you the question, these differences between, yes, three aspects, like, theology, spirituality, and religiosity.
Well, that's, again, thank you for restating the question, because it can go in many directions. But I think fundamentally, spirituality is the most important element here, because, each one of us in our deepest self, our deepest core, is pure spirit. So there isn't one of us who doesn't have an inner access to the divine, to God, to Brahman. And we can awaken it through a contemplative practice. Now, most people aren't contemplatives, but they have contemplative moments, moments of deep mystical appreciation of nature, or when they observe some beautiful moral act and they feel something deep within awaken. And these are grace notes in our lives. And if we had a religion, which is more of an institutionalized structure that supported that through an appropriate form of education, like in a traditional Gurukula or in traditional European societies. I went to a Catholic school in Brooklyn, and they taught us to pray and to be alert to some degree. So if we become alert to those inner grace notes, we can then begin to walk the spiritual path. But religion can be helpful insofar as it supports our walking on this path, and insofar as it can create societies that aren't just consumerist, based on consumerism and the worship of celebrities. And so traditional religions have their place too, but not one of them can ever be taken as the final reality or the final truth. I'm a pluralist. I've been arguing for religious pluralism for over 30 years. I've written multiple books and many articles and given many talks on religious pluralism. The idea, religious pluralism isn't equivalent to Enlightenment secular liberalism, which just says, yeah, whatever religion, if you like to follow that old superstition, fine, but be tolerant. Don't try to impose your views on the rest of us. Religious pluralism, mystical pluralism, is the idea that the divine or being is infinite, and so consequently any religious language or any theological talk can only express in a local and finite manner something of the magnificence of the divine life. So we can follow a theology and a religion insofar as it supports spirituality, but when it begins to impede spirituality, then we have to criticize theology and religion in light of the more profound level of religiosity, which is deep mystical experience.
Do you think that most of the popular people in the street, they're not looking for these spiritual experiences? That should be, let's say, the end in different fields of religiosity, where you aim at reaching what the Hindus call samadhi, or nirvana. But when you come to this type of monotheistic, religions, so you come to see God is speaking through us, who are the congregation of religiosity, that we belong to Christianity. And many people become like a fundamentalists in that thinking. And yes, you have to believe, in a sense or another, that happiness or eternity is going to appear in front of you once you are dead, when you go, to the beyond. So there is a big difference in between the Oriental thought that you can become like a Jiva Mukti or liberated life, a liberated person, in this very life. But then, on the other side, in these traditions of these different religions, you actually depend on the head of that church that is going to lead you through different beliefs and creeds. So you have to follow, what they preach. In other words, if you look at Christianity, you say God is on our side. If you look at Islam, Allah is the greatest, and so on and so forth. So in such a diversity of religions and plural different ideas about God, in a sense, through your studies and your works, through comparative religion, what do you have to say about comparative religion and also comparative mysticism? Because a Christian mystic, like in Spain, we have Santa Teresa de Avila, St. John of the Cross, for instance, which are quite big. If you go to India, you're going to find whoever. You mentioned Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharshi, it depends on which tradition. So it brings it's a big separation in ideas, in concepts, So, and when you come to study this comparatively, what your final conclusion about this?
Right. Again, that's a good set of observations, and it highlights the essential need for comparative religion and comparative theology and comparative mysticism. You know, if as an American, I speak English, and I can stumble along in German, and I can read a few languages, scholarly languages, and I can speak a little bit of that's a handicap I have. But in Europe, I encounter so many people who are multilingual, trilingual, and in India, people are speaking 5 languages. You know, if you only know one language, then you have no basis for knowing how language works at a deeper level. And my own experiences of my cross-linguistic experiences show me that, oh, well, you think this way in English, but then you think that way in German. That's a very simple example. If I look out on the street, I see that there are multiple vehicles there. There are different kinds of vehicles, but they all do the same thing. So there's an electric vehicle, there's a truck, there's maybe a bus out there somewhere, and even there's a plane up above, and they're all vehicles, and they basically get you from point A to point B. That's otherwise, unless you're a collector, you don't really have that much interest in them. You want to get somewhere. And with language, you want to also do something. So it doesn't matter whether it's Spanish or English, but there are different ways of doing things in Spanish than in English or in German. And so similarly with religion, this is an insight that arose in Western universities after the encounter with Sanskrit, with Sanskritam. The German scholars and British scholars began to see that there was a connection, a fundamental connection between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek. And this led to comparative linguistics, but it also energized comparative religion. And what's important in comparative religion, to take a simple example, many people will notice that in Christianity, there's a doctrine of incarnation. God became a human being. And then you study Hinduism, you see, oh, they have the same teaching. It's avatara, that God becomes, oh, well, in Hinduism, of course, it's great. You know, it's like Sanskrit has more letters than the English alphabet, so it has more deities incarnating than in Christianity. So it's from beginnings like that, seeing that there are similarities between religious traditions, that comparative religion grows from that insight. But as soon as you begin to think comparatively about religion, it's hard then to say, well, you know, English is the only real language. Although a lot of people might think that today. It's not. Or Spanish is the one true language. Or Madrid is the true city and New York doesn't even count. No, that's an absurd way of thinking. It's like thinking, you know, my team is the only real team and your teams are all a bunch of fakers.
So I suppose,
yes.
Sorry. Keep going, please.
So with comparative religion, this is a technique of spiritual liberation, and I practiced it for many years, teaching students who often came from fundamentalistic backgrounds, especially where I lived in those days in the US. I mean, US has a lot more religious diversity of fundamentalistic religious movements than Europe does. I mean, you've got many opportunities to join religious movements that you may not even have heard of here in Europe. And so for them to see that there are similarities between religions was an aha moment. Oh, you know, in Christianity, a lot of my students were Protestant, mostly Protestant, and they had the idea that you're only saved through faith, not through any works. You're saved by just believing. And then you discover that there's also a kind of a large Buddhist movement that's actually even more influential in many parts of the world and the United States, especially in the West, than meditational Buddhism. The idea that just by faith in the Lotus Sutra, or faith in Amida Buddha, that's all you need. And then you're saved and you go to a pure land when you die. That's an aha moment for students, because then you have to think that, well, either there's some kind of human impulse that some people want to have a deep spiritual practice and others want it simple. They just want something, tell me what to do, and I'll just do it. I don't want to know how the computer works. People used to say 30 years ago, I just want the thing to go. I don't want to know anything about the coding. Just give the thing to me. I want to go online. I don't want any deeper knowledge. So that's where the role of comparative religion comes in. It helps us to see similarities between religious traditions. And that can be liberative. It can also, for some, be very unsettling. The academic study of religion also forces some people to become more fundamentalistic, because their defenses go up and they resist the idea that their religion is not the only true religion.
And what type of differences do you find in between the academic world, where you actually go deep into the study of these main religions and what they're trying to say to you? And if you compare this academic world and you go into a practical way through different techniques and methods, like in India, you got yoga, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on and so forth, that there is a consensus here in the sense that we have three states of mind, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Eastern and Western thought, come to this agreement. However, if we look at the different Upanishads, like let's say Mandukya Upanishad, they tell us, they talk about a fourth state, of being.
Turiya, yes.
Turiya in this case, or you call it Samadhi in yoga, and so on and so forth.
Samadhi, yeah.
But you depend here from a God who is going to send you this, or who is going to bring you that, or who is going to give you such and such a thing. The mystery of life in which we are, we try to discover, to discern, to think, to ponder. I mean, why is it that I am here? What happens to me after life? Why is it I suffer? Why is it, that life doesn't give me everything I want? So from the perspective, from the point of view of these religions, what could you say? I mean, in Christianity, for instance, God is waiting for you when you die, whatever, So you have certain ideas constructed about the beyond. However, in the Oriental world, you have the freedom in a sense that you can choose what to do in order to transcend and go to a different state of mind. So being yourself a scholar, having, thinking and teaching about all these subjects, what can you say about these differences?
Well, I am an academic. I am an emeritus professor, but I didn't start on that path because I wanted to become a professor. After the Krishna movement, I spent many years wandering around the US from one religious group to another, and then in India. And I was basically a seeker, and I was a spiritual practitioner. I also was engaged with other Hindu movements in the US as well. And it only happened later that I became an academic. I started out in life, and I still retain in my retirement in my own sense of myself as a spiritual practitioner and as a person who's on the path to awakening. That's how I see myself. My academic studies didn't actually help that. It hindered it. I can say that after I received my doctoral degree and started teaching, I was at the lowest point spiritually in my life. And it took some years for me to recover my spiritual practice, because the academic study of religion, it's at a university. Universities globally, but in the English-speaking world, are dominated by a kind of profound physicalist materialism. I mean, when we die, we're dead, and that's it. And religion is studied if you really study religion and you teach it according to the way you are schooled, then you approach religion from the outside externally. You look at its social structures, you criticize it in terms of some form of critical social theory. You may study the language or the history, but you don't practice it, because to practice it is actually to become engaged by it. When you want to criticize it, you want to see how it's oppressed people, how it's liberated people. These are the interests. So they're completely secondary to the religions themselves. And a lot of people go into the field with some spiritual interest, and they tend to lose it along the way. And many others go into the study of religion the same way somebody else might go into the study of economics.
Do you think that nowadays there is a change? Is there any new science of religion? In other words, as you mentioned, being a scholar yourself, you have combined both fields, let's say, the academic world, but at the same time, you have that big interest in finding some answers about your life. And that's why probably you were looking at the East, in other words, because the East, in a sense, was giving you some tools in order, to throw you, to impel you to think in a different way, to ample your mind, to widen up, your thoughts, your way of looking at life and religion. So being yourself so much interested in India, where you have been some time, it seems to me that you got these texts which are a real treasure of knowledge, like the Upanishad, like the Bhagavad Gita, even like the Yoga Sutra, the practice of yoga, and so on and so forth. What can you say about India? What can you say about Hinduism? What can you say about their way of looking at life and looking for an answer to the mystery of life?
Well, this morning, as I was thinking about our talk this morning, the thought occurred to me that India is actually the teacher of humankind. It's a bold statement. India is the spiritual teacher of the world. And India has an unbroken ancient culture. The Greek culture, the Western European cultures, their ancient religions were all supplanted by the Abrahamic religions. It didn't happen completely in India. India has a deep connection to its primordial ancient traditions, which live to this day. And the preservation of Sanskrit and of Sanskrit culture and of the Gurukulam system help to preserve and these values, and of course the unbroken stream of sadhus and siddhas and yogis and saints to this very moment, is the reason why yoga and vegetarianism and meditation have spread across the planet, because of people like Swami Ramatirtha, Paramahansa Yogananda, Vivekananda in the first generations. And then later, all of the swamis and sannyasins, almost all celibate figures, sannyasins. I mean, this is to the Western mind, the idea. I was reading in a German newspaper yesterday, someone said the monasteries are all closing. Who wants to live a life of celibacy? What's the point of that? There's no realization there of the channeling of the spiritual energy that into a more sublime, to sublimate that energy so that it creates a higher level of vision and creativity. That whole idea, which was understood perhaps in medieval European monasteries, is completely lost. So India has actually, through the spread of yoga and meditation, through its spiritual teachers, has given a great gift to the planet. And for me, as a confused teenager in New York, and I wasn't alone, there were lots of us in the 60s in America, and then in Western Europe, and in Spain, and in England, and Australia, we responded intuitively to the message of these swamis from India, and also Buddhist teachers as well. We responded intuitively to the call of an ancient integral culture that wasn't just about consumption and worshiping celebrities and making money and having a big house and a car and having all of that, but it was about going deeply within in order to awaken to the divine life that lives within us and which is our destiny. And that's a healing message. It's an integral message. And that's why so many of us responded to it. We weren't getting it any longer in any way from our educational institutions, and our religions had become desiccated. The awakening of contemplative movements within Catholicism in the United States, as a result, was the result, for the most part, of Father Thomas Keating, who was a colleague of Thomas Merton, who started a movement called Centering Prayer, is explicit. He said, we saw in our monasteries all these young people going off to India and to Thailand, and we said, oh, we also have some contemplative methods. Why don't they come to us? And they weren't coming to them. Who even knew they had these methods? And then they began, in response to that, to develop the contemplative dimensions of Catholicism. So this thought occurred to me this morning. It's not a new thought with me, but the old Gurukulam system, which Prabhupada gave to us, and which in Yoga Vidya and Shivananda Yoga Vedanta centers as well. These are places today, here in Germany, for instance, the Yoga Vidya centers are places where anybody can go and get, without realizing it's even happening, have the deep values of the old Hindu, Indian spiritual way of life inculcated within you. And it marks you for life. It changes you forever when you have that experience. That happens also in the Shivananda centers. There aren't so many places any longer where this can occur, because the materialism and physicalism of Western culture ultimately turns everything into a product and into a marketing opportunity and some way to promote yourself on social media. Sad. It's just the dynamism of capitalism. And somehow or other, with these other movements, we're able to find identities that are not shaped by the market and market forces.
Yeah, that's a lovely description, you know, of searching, somebody who's searching for some meaning in life, and at the same time trying to attempt a different state of mind according to the, you know, the teachings of these great gurus that went basically mostly to America. Could you mention some of them in which you're having a lot of interest in their teachings and you're having influenced by them? All of them, you know, most of them went to the States. Nowadays, as you have mentioned, things have changed so much that in our culture, meditation, in a sense, and many other practices are used in order to have only the well-being of the body and the mind. There you have, for instance, the so well accepted in our society like mindfulness, that is losing part, you know, of the meaning that is coming from Buddhism. Then we can talk about that. But first of all, I'd like to know of these gurus, you know, from the Buddhist world and the Hindu world, for instance, even from the point of view of Christianity or Judaism.
Well, what happened after? Sorry. Did you finish the thought?
Have got, you know, the influence. We you know, you have thought. When do you incline towards this type
So
of
after, when I left the Krishna movement, and then I went through a phase of being a Christian, and then that's when I went to Harvard Divinity School and began to study religion. And while I was there, of course, I lived at the Center for the Study of World Religion, so there were people from multiple religious traditions. There were Buddhist teachers and Hindu swamis and academics. And that was about in the early 80s, and then I started going to some of the local Buddhist centers. There were Tibetan centers, there were Vajrayana centers, and there were insight meditation centers. And I began to then sit and meditate and began to take some initiations into different Buddhist lineages. So there was a good period of time there where I even considered myself Buddhist. And I was deeply shaped by Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, but also I was deeply attracted to Theravada Buddhism, to the insight meditation path. And later I was on retreats at a Theravada Buddhist meditation center in the US. But, you know, something about the old devotional path of bhakti still always kept calling to me. But at this point, I had become so deeply immersed in reading the Upanishads And then I began also to visit the Shivananda Vedanta Yoga centers. And so Swami Vishnu Devananda's students, I was never an initiated member of that. I just like to go to the ashrams.
By the way, he was here in Vigo with me very many times. Swami Vishnu
He was there with you.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I think that I know that you and your friends, you're all, of course, initiated disciples of Swami Vishnu Devananda. And I have great admiration for him and, of course, for Swami Shivananda. I mean, Swami Shivananda has blessed the entire planet. When you think about all of his influential disciples like Swami Vishnu, but also Satchidananda with Yogaville, where I visited many times over the years, but also the other Swamis is Swami Chinmayananda, then Swami Satyananda, but then also Swami Dayananda from Arshavidya Gurukulam. And I went on numerous retreats, and I saw Swami Vishnu Dayananda one time in Rishikesh. I heard him speak. So, and there were of course, other Hindu saints who came. Of course, there was Amachi. I remember being hugged by her many decades ago before she was world famous. It was a small crowd in Boston, but there was also there were other Hindu teachers that I encountered along the way. And so for me, what then became imperative in recent years was to try to bring together the non-dual path of Advaita Vedanta, but also to still somehow remain true to the bhakti experience of Krishna. And I could never become a radical Kevala Advaitavadan, that there's just being that's formless. Yes, that's true. But for me, the forms of existence arise from the infinite Brahman, which is formless, not because it's just empty, but because no form can fully encapsulate it. So it is the ground and the sponsor of the beautiful forms of existence, which especially in the deeper realms of spiritual experience, we begin to experience at the higher levels of the Manomaya Kosha, for instance, we begin to experience the divine realms. And these are form realms, no doubt, Sambhoga Kaya, or if you will, these are realms that are part of Sampragyata Samadhi, no doubt. But they're still beautiful and they're encouraging. And we live in dried out, secularized societies, and to simply take a no spiritual experience is ultimate approach is to kind of crush out the awakening spirituality of people. So too much Advaita Vedanta can be a little bit of an impediment on the path. I think we have to balance Advaita Vedanta jnana, pure jnana, with a really strong touch of bhakti.
Yeah, more or less in the thought of Ramanuja than Shankaracharya, probably.
Yes. A little more Ramanuja. And I think a great example of this, of course, is Ramakrishna. Wonderful example of that. I mean, he was a person, he always famously said, I want to taste the sugar. I don't want to be the sugar. And I would say, yes, why not? And why not both? Yes, why choose? There's no choosing. That you can be the sugar and taste the sugar, because why should you just want to be the sugar? The sugar has a flavor. So for me, that's a nice way of synthesizing the bhakti and the Advaita.
Okay,
Advaita, and the Advaita paths.
Dr. Rose, let's go for a moment to the Bhagavad Gita,
yes,
which is like a jewel of, they say it's a jewel of spirituality. In there, it contains so many different teachings through those 18 chapters. Basically it's a dialogue between us, Arjuna, and God himself, which could be represented by Krishna. Now, first of all, I'd like to know your opinion. How is it that this Bhagavad Gita is taught in a battlefield? Is it the famous fight between the light and darkness in different religions? What do you think is the meaning of that? I mean, such a high, spiritual teaching, how can it be? Because many people actually, they reject, that type of thought. I mean, how is it possible that this jewel of spirituality is going to be talking about in the film. And then,
Yeah.
apart from this, which come to be the main teachings that the Gita are teaching us in order.
Yes. You know, the Gita is a very, it's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful scripture. I've been reading it for over 50 years. I love it. The Song of the Lord, the Song of Bhagavan. But a lot of people, especially in our day and age, given the terrible wars that we've had, and given that people in the spiritual world generally are not violent people, and we're averse to criminal warfare, it's hard for us to really imagine Krishna giving that advice to Arjuna to just basically kill them all because they're Brahmin. You know, it's my order, just do it. So, you know, with any sacred scripture, this is where the value of an academic approach comes in, or a comparative approach. Ultimately, and Shankara would say this as well, the scriptures don't control our spiritual life. The scriptures are not the source of our spiritual life, as some religions might think. We are the source of the spiritual life. And I don't mean I as Ken Rose, but the Atman, the Paramatman within us is the source of the spiritual life. And apart from Anubhava, even Shankara says the scriptures are not useful. They have to be verified through experience. So I think the deepest teaching of the Gita is that in the difficult circumstances of our life, we have a dharma, we have a calling, if you will, and it can be it is a spiritual practice to not abandon that. And that's, of course, karma yoga. That's following our dharma. But the Gita doesn't stop there, you know. I mean, as it goes on, Krishna also says that his deepest teaching, and it's, of course, in Bhagavad Gita 1866, is to surrender everything to me. Mamekam vraja, go to me for refuge, right? The deepest truth of the Gita is that Krishna's disciples are very dear to him. And so ultimately, I think the Gita, even though scholars differ and you can build different yogic paths from it, I think the integral approach of Shivananda, which of course, was emerging slowly in Indian doctrinal discussions before Vivekananda, despite what some contemporary scholars say, this notion of a kind of an integral yoga was developing already a couple of 3-4 centuries ago in India. The idea is that we have to integrate these different paths, and ultimately the highest path, I think, in the Gita is bhakti, or love for God, love for Krishna, love for Brahman, that is, of course, grounded in the knowledge that all of us are not separate from Brahman, and that as a result, if our calling is such, we should and can work in the world in order to help, for loka sangraha, for the protection of the world. But if our calling calls us to solitude, then we should also take the path of sannyas or the path of vanaprastha. We can also go that way. It's not an either or. Just to make one point about comparative religion, just yesterday I was reading Thomas Merton, and he was talking about how in the Catholic tradition there has always been a divide between the path of action and the path of contemplation, the contemplative life and the active life. And the active livers generally there's more of them, and so they generally degrade the contemplative path to a kind of narcissistic path. And that occurred to me that actually the idea is similar to what occurs in Hinduism, and the conflict between those who are more jnanis and those who are more karma yogis. And it's not that we have to choose one or the other. They're all valid paths, and we should follow that path that most appeals to us. And when one gets a little bit too dry, when we're too much into jnana, then maybe it's time for a little bit of bhakti. And if we're doing too much karma yoga, maybe it's time for a little bit of contemplation. So I don't take the Bhagavad Gita literally. I couldn't take it literally. And then it wouldn't work. We have a different cultural setting.
Yeah. So if we go for a moment with Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher, when he spoke about the Asian era, that in different parts of the world, in Greece you got Socrates and Plato, you got in India the Upanishads, Buddhism, and also the Abrahamic prophets. So in different parts of the world were happening something, a change in the outlook about life and thought, human thought. So in a sense, could we do apply this type of knowledge from the past and compare it with the perennial philosophy of which, among others, Aldous Huxley was speaking about? Let's say there is like a consensus in these types of thought, of searches. And we could put them within, the context of the perennial philosophy, looking for something beyond our comprehension of the limited through the reasoning, and being, in a sense, like slaves or being prisoners of the limitation of our bodies and our minds. It comes to be also in the world of Maimonides or Avicenna on Aquinas, that they were talking that you cannot limit, which is illimited, because you cannot comprehend it. It's beyond the comprehension of the human mind. So here, where we could have different rivers that come to the main one, and just to overflow into the ocean, of consciousness, which could come to be this perennial philosophy approach.
Well, that you raised the issue of perennial philosophy, and Aldous Huxley made that famous with his book of that title 70 years ago. And the idea of perennialism is it's very popular often among spiritual seekers and alternative spiritual communities. But what a lot of people don't realize is that it's a concept that has been rejected, stoutly rejected by academics, academic students of religion for at least 40 years. At least now it's more like 50 years. It's seen as naive. It's seen as essentializing and as blurring the differences between the religions. So you have to understand that academics who study religion are generally interested in the differences. In a way, the average person gets in a car and says, oh yeah, I have a Toyota, or I've got a Honda, and whatever, but it gets me there. But academic scholars of religion, they're not so much interested in driving the car somewhere. They're interested in studying the paint color and the shape of the lights and how the steering wheel looks and what the seat is like. And they want to write a description of that. And that's what they do. They write descriptions of what this specific car looks like. And any attempt to relate that car to similar cars in terms of their function and using the function is rejected as perennialism. Now that's a caricature, I understand. And if the book that you mentioned, of course, I go into great detail arguing against what's called constructivism. And I don't use the term perennialism, not because I'm averse to it, but because it's been so poisoned by the academic bias against it that I just use a different term. I call it essentialism.
Okay,
essentialism.
Yes. So let me put you this question, Dr. Rose. We are talking about mysticism, just to go beyond the limits of our body and our minds, according to these Oriental philosophies, basically Buddhism and Hindu philosophy. But nowadays in our society, the tendency when we do practice meditation is only just to, to fight stress and to have a different condition of mind, just to be more relaxed, to be able to focus the mind, to develop attention, concentration, and so on and so forth. So, and the different experts in the neuroscience field, they call it contemplative neuroscience, and even they speak about the spiritual brain, like neurons, for instance. So, how can you make a difference between the traditional way of meditation that leads you, to a different state of mind, and how meditation is basically taught nowadays?
Yes. Yes, well, this has been a subject in the academic world of a good deal of pushback by people who, and also from traditional Buddhists as well, who see mindfulness as it's spread globally as a, if you will, a marketable commodity that has stripped from the whole complex of traditional Buddhist practices and worldview, which of course involves a belief in reincarnation or karma, more precisely, and spiritual worlds and rebirth, as well as nirvana. This has led to a creation of a kind of de-Buddhicized Buddhism, which isn't even called Buddhism, and rightfully so, mindfulness, where you simply practice for 15 or 20 minutes, becoming aware of your breath, of your bodily sensations, and then there's a reduction. Clearly, it's been demonstrated through scientific research that there are salutary benefits, good benefits from mindfulness meditation. Great, nobody's going to argue against that, but it's not Buddhism. And so it can create a kind of blockage between the tradition and everything it offers and this simple practice. And that happens with yoga too. There's the complaint that the yoga of yoga studios is just a commodity. It's not the real thing. It strips yoga of all of its traditional trappings. Yeah, that's also true. But it's also true that for a lot of people, that's the entranceway into a deeper encounter with Asian religious traditions. And it happens with mindfulness too. So you have to approach people where they are. And most people, frankly speaking, the average person isn't that interested in religion or spirituality these days. I mean, there's just too much more, as someone said in the German article I read, there's a lot more interesting things happening today than praying or meditating. You've got generative AI, you've got your web page, or you've got your Substack, you've got to moderate your YouTube channel, you have to be an influencer. I mean, life's filled with so many more diversions. Why would you want to spend your time sitting in the corner? And most people are also not interested in the Hindu deities, and they're actually a little bit put off by all of that. So, for instance, Ramana Maharshi's teaching is a great doorway for a lot of people into Advaita Vedanta, because it just seems very simple. All you do is just become aware of yourself as the self, of the root of your consciousness. But what people don't realize is that Ramana Maharshi was also a bhakta. He was a devotee of Arunachala. He wrote some of his most exquisite writings, actually, were hymns of praise to Arunachala, in using the language of bridal mysticism and the language that John of the Cross, in his moments of deep acedia, of the dark night of the soul, would have recognized as viraha bhakti, a longing to be at one with the divine, but yet because of this body, because of time, because of whatever other obstacle, I cannot, the union with the divine, with Brahman, with Arunachala, with God, with Jesus, cannot be consummated yet. Ramana Maharshi has that whole aspect. Also, if you go to his ashram in South India, there's a temple to his mother as a deity. There is a Shi Chakra image that has daily or regular ceremonies. There are young boys learning the Vedas. It's a Hindu setting. The bhakti path is there with the jnana path. But you don't have to go any deeper than just becoming aware of yourself as Atman. If that's as far as you want to go, that's as far as you want to go.
Dr. Rose, my God,
Yes.
So lovely that I would stay here forever.
Yes.
Coming to an end, but I'd like to know from your point of view that you have, lived that countercultural movement in the States, which was very strong. And you see, the well of yoga has changed a lot. So nowadays, basically in the modern type of yoga, as you mentioned before, basically the teaching comes to be asanas, the practice of only a part of Hatha Yoga.
Mhm.
There you go, like great figures, Swami Shivananda, his disciples, Swami Kuvalayananda, we got Krishnamacharya and his disciples, Pata Vijoy, Iyengar, Desikachar, and so forth. So nowadays in our culture, yoga basically, generally speaking, means asana. So
Yes.
what is your experience? What do you think about that? Being yourself so much involved in these areas of knowledge and practice.
Well, there are a lot of good yoga scholars, people like Edwin Bryant and Christopher Chappell, and James Mallinson, and many others who have a balanced view of these traditions.
And we have here with us, my neighbor, it comes to me now, Mark Singleton.
Mark Singleton too, of course. Yes, Mark Singleton works with, and they have the book, The Roots of Yoga, and he was just there. And other many, but these are the main names right now in the academic study of yoga, I would say. And there's a term in the Yoga Sutra, Yata Bhimata, which means, in a way, it means as you like. Practice in whatever way works for you, right? In whatever way works. That's a very Hindu approach to things. I like to think of the Hindu tradition as not saying to us, do this and don't do that. It's simply saying, as you like. No, you don't need to choose. Why choose? Choose everything. If it's a choice between a little bit of asana and a path, the full yogic path, then don't choose one or the other. Choose both. Accept both. If it's a choice between bhakti, it's not a choice between bhakti and jnana. Choose both. Take both. So my attitude is towards the contemporary yoga scene is very tolerant and very liberal and very broad-minded, like the Yoga Sutra itself. It's wonderful that people practice asana. When you do asana and your breath is coordinated with your bodily movements, it's not like being at the gym when you've got your pod stuck in your ear and you're watching a television screen and you're totally distracted. No, your breath is synchronized with your bodily movements, and whether you know it or not, you're experiencing the flow of prana. And prana is a luminous energy that's filled with deities and devas and mystical experiences. And people, without even realizing it, begin to awaken a little bit of yoga pratyaksha, yogic intuition. And they think when they leave the yoga studio, oh, I feel good. It's a beautiful day. I feel a little bit of love for things today. Where's that coming from? I don't think I'm going to eat that hamburger today. I think I'm going to go get something vegan. That cigarette, if you were smoking, I don't need that any longer. Or that glass of wine, I don't need that. I'm getting a little bit moralistic now, I understand. But the lifestyle changes. You become more aware of your actions. And then maybe, and it doesn't have to happen because we have many lifetimes ahead of us, as many as we like. It's up to us. Maybe then we start to go a little bit deeper. We go to Yoga Vidya, or we go to the Yoga Ranch or someplace like that, or we go to a Krishna temple, or we get on the plane and go to India.
So I am glad that we are so universal and pluralistic and so tolerant in your ideas. People like you, Dr. Rose, what we need nowadays. So just to end this basic, generally I ask my guests like yourself, which for me is a privilege to have you here, with so much knowledge and giving us so much lessons, so many lessons actually, about religion, about diversity, about pluralism, about yoga, meditation, and so on and so forth. I heard you telling a few stories, in different parts of your teachings, in different courses like the world religions. And I'd like to ask you, to illustrate some part of this teaching and knowledge to teach out to tell us a story, the one that comes to your mind. And then we could end, if you feel like it, you could guide us or lead us through a couple of meditations, one from the Christian, faith, another one from the Hindu world, and we'd end, and people who would be interested in watching us, watching actually yourself and your works, they could then, once they close the video, close their eyes and go into this mood, the meditation that you could, guide us. So please, if you tell us first of a story and then we come for the final meditations.
Well, a story that no specific story immediately comes to mind, but I do see myself at 19, and I had just encountered the Hare Krishnas, and as a result of that, I decided that I was also going to renounce the world. And so I was working at a job. I was only 19. I hadn't gone to college yet. And I quit everything and I put a little backpack on my back and I wandered down my street where I lived in Brooklyn. And I remember turning back and waving up the street at my worried mother, wondering where I was going. And I got on a bus. I didn't have a car in those days. I was a New Yorker. And I got on a bus and I went in what to me was the wilds of deep America, somewhere out there somewhere, I'm from the coast, I'm from the city. And I got off this bus and I had to hitchhike, and some farmers took me to up where the Hare Krishnas lived. The Hare Krishnas, they live up there. And I had to walk up this pathway that was filled with mud into 2 miles to find the place. I had no idea if anybody was even at the end of the 2 miles. And as a city kid from New York, I didn't even know what was in the woods. I didn't know what was out there. And after 2 miles of trudging through mud and hearing all sorts of odd sounds, I turned a bend and I saw deep in a valley what was then one of the early Hare Krishna communities, and all of these people dressed in Indian clothing working in the fields. And that began, for me, that was my renunciation of the world and my turn to the spiritual life. Like a classic sadhaka in India, I had turned my back on my identity as Ken Rose, and I began to assume a different identity as a spiritual seeker in one of the great schools of Hindu teaching that came with the Swamis to the West. For a meditation, for me, meditation has really simplified itself over the decades. And it's what I would say to bring myself to that mood is that I would just become aware of my breath for a moment or two. After so many words, to link my thoughts now with my breath instead of with my brain. And the first teaching that really impressed me in the Krishna movement, which was the first of my spiritual paths, was when in Prabhupada's books, he said, "We're not this body." I thought, what? If I'm not my body, who am I? But we're not these bodies. Sure, we have a body. I have a car down there. Maybe I'll drive it later. I have a body, this body right now. If I'm not my body, what then am I? And that, of course, is a deep and profound question. We're pure spirit, pure consciousness. We have a soul. And by turning our attention within, going within, Jesus called us to go within. The Buddha taught us to go within. He said, here are the roots of trees, meditate. The Yoga Sutra, Hinduism in general, the Upanishads teach us to go within. And our minds should become still. And of course, that's where the practice of meditation or contemplative prayer comes in. But our minds can't be still if our thoughts are concerned with anger or hatred or too much consumption. So there's a need for an ascetical practice, tapas, of some sort, a gentle ascetical practice to wean ourselves a little bit from the external objects, not out of punishment, but simply to be able to become sensitive to the deeper self within that's always there, a radiant light at the core of our being. Radiant light, pure bliss, pure consciousness. And just hearing about it is enough to awaken, for many of us often, our sensitivity to it. Just hearing that we are eternal spirit, we're Satchitananda, we're pure being, blissful being, eternal being. There is no death. Death is just a word. It relates to the body, but it doesn't relate to our true selves. There is no death in pure consciousness. There's no birth. And if somehow or other we can find our way, if even a glimmer of this awakens within us, whether through reading John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, or whether through reading a great Hindu text, or hearing the word of a teacher, of a great teacher, if we get a glimpse of that light, then that is where we should stay. And let that light teach us everything we need to know about the spiritual life. And so as I end these comments, this was more of a guided meditation than an actual meditation. But I would ask you, if there's quietness for you after the end of this video, to spend some time just becoming aware of your innermost self as the beautiful consciousness of the divine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rose, as being an exceptional, pressure. I want to show you my gratitude for these beautiful lessons, about pluralism, mysticism, religious thoughts and everything. So I am really profoundly, grateful to you for giving me the chance and the opportunity to speak to such a big scholar in these fields. So thank you.
Thank you, Madonna. I thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed speaking to you and your community, and look forward to seeing more of your videos and maybe even meeting you in person at some point in the lovely town of Vigo, Spain.
You are welcome to come anytime. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.